Welcome, everyone, to Creating a Family, talk about adoption and foster care. I'm Dawn Davenport. I am the host of this show as well as the director of the nonprofit creatingafamily.org. Today, we're going to be talking about a story of identical twins separated at birth. Today, we'll be talking with Erica Hayasaki. She is a journalist and the author of Somewhere Sisters. She is also the author of The Death Class, a true story about life. She is a professor of literary journalism at the University of California, Irvine. Welcome, Erica, to Creating a Family.
Thanks for having me.
I love the book. I absolutely love Somewhere Sister. It was well written. I mean, that seems like a false compliment or a secondhand type of compliment, but it was well written. It is a true story. It is nonfiction, and I won't say that it plays out as if it is a novel. It doesn't, but it captured me from the beginning to the end. And I am interested in this topic, but honestly, even if I wasn't interested in the topic, I would have loved the book. So great job, and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for reading it.
Let's start by telling, and we're going to talk about a lot of different things today, but I think it helps if we ground it in the story of the book. There was a set of twins in Vietnam. Take it from there. Lay out the basics of this story.
Sure. So the story is a true story, and it begins with a set of identical twins born in Vietnam in the late 1990s, and they are separated at birth. So their birth mother, could not take care of them herself. She did not have the means to do so, even though she did love them. She ends up taking one of the daughters named Lon to an orphanage. And then the other daughter ends up getting adopted essentially by her sister. So it's by the child's biological aunt and her aunt's partner. And they raise her in a village in Vietnam. The other sister's name is Ha. So it's Ha and Lon. Lon is then adopted to a family in the US when she's 4, along with another young girl at the time from the orphanage, New, who was friends with her but not biologically related. They moved to America with a family in the Midwest, and they're raised, in America together. And the twins spend much of their lives not knowing much of anything about each other until one day they end up getting reunited. So that sort of sets the narrative of the book.
The stage.
Yeah, but it's about much more. Yeah.
No, very much more.
Yeah, much more.
The girls spent the first couple of months, the twins spent the first couple of months of life together, and then their mom was not able to. She was homeless and had other issues.
Yeah.
One of the girls, Ha, was too sick to have been accepted at the orphanage.
Yes.
And then she was, as you say, although perhaps not legally, but certainly in every other way, adopted by her aunt and her aunt's partner.
Yeah. And in fact, I think they did go through the paperwork to make her, legally their child. And
well, she certainly put her on the family registry and everything.
And the family register
right,
and everything.
Right.
Yeah. So Ha was raised with 2 mothers. She considered them both her parents. And then, of course, she knew her birth mother, but from a distance. She would come by it, but she considered the 2 women who raised her to be her parents. And so she lived that life in Vietnam in a village, and she was, she lived a beautiful life in the village, not really thinking much about America or her twin sister, although she did think about her, but didn't set out to find her herself. She was raised Buddhist. She was raised in a village that had, sporadic electricity, and there were sometimes storms that would wipe away the entire village and they'd have to rebuild. So she had a simpler life in terms of the means, but it was a good life. And then meanwhile, on the opposite end of the world, her twin sister was raised in a suburb of Chicago and, went to a Catholic school. Her family was quite wealthy. So she had a lot of privileges that come with being, upper class in America, upper middle class in America. I should be upper class. And, also had a very loving family. So they had these two very different lives, though, and different kinds of struggles throughout their lives. Yeah, so that is part of the story.
That's part of the story. Let's talk now about twin studies. We're going to come back to
Sure.
And Luan was her American name is Isabella. Just so we
Right.
so we have Ha and Isabella. Am I pronouncing Ha's name right? So it's Ha and Isabella, and then the other girl who was adopted at 3, I think, from the same orphanage at the same time. Her name will be Olivia, although she won't.
Yeah.
We probably won't end up talking quite as much about her. All right, so let's talk some about twin studies. I have been fascinated for a long time, and in fact, let me refer our listeners. We have done a number of shows on the whole nature versus nurture, and we did a specific show with some of the same experts that you interviewed, Erica, for the book. Dr. Nancy Siegel, and then there's another Minnesota twin study, and I'm blanking on the name, but you can find those interviews. They are recorded. We did them quite a few years ago, but you can search for them either on your app that you're using, or you could go to our website, creatingafamily.org, click on, or just search for the name twin studies, and you will see we've done a lot on there, because I find it fascinating, because the whole concept of nature versus nurture. Not that we would ever want anybody to create this experiment, but once it has been created, we can learn a lot. So give us some history of the different types of twin studies, and then take it from there as far as some of the stuff that we have learned.
Yeah, so Nancy Siegel, who you said you had on your podcast, is one of the world. She is a leading expert in twin studies and runs a twin research center out here in California, which is how I actually connected to these twins, because I have twins. I have identical twins myself. And that was sort of what got me originally interested in writing about twins. And so, throughout history, there have been studies going way back, which have been particularly interested in twins separated, right, at birth, and trying to study, who they eventually become to determine how much your genes matter in shaping who you are, right? Whether it's your personality, or really a lot of the studies have focused on IQ and intellectual abilities. But scientists have long been fascinated. People who are not scientists have long been fascinated in these twin studies as well. And also adoption studies have also been part of this world. So studying children who have been adopted and raised by other families, and then going back and trying to understand the traits of their birth families versus their, who they became, and if they're more similar to their adoptive families. Again, to determine, do genes matter, or is it the environment that shapes who you are? And throughout history, it's gone back and forth on genes versus environment. There have been some very dark experiments, I should say, going back to, Nazi Germany, and twins have been separated. Twins have been separated in the name of science in the US, and not told about each other and studied. That has happened. And then, of course, under Nazi Germany, they were not only separated, but that sometimes held captive and tortured and experimented on. So it does get, and this is again to for them, it was trying to understand genes mattering, and mattering above all else, to essentially create, how do we create these more perfect humans, and, going down the road of eugenics, so selective breeding, and all of these ugly kind of topics. So unfortunately, twin studies have a controversial and dark history. And environmental behaviorism also has some weird studies that I get into in the book. But what I've come to understand through the research is that, while we've gone back and forth, and we do know that genes play a role, there is an interplay between genes and your environment, and environment can play a role in switching your genes on and off. So that's, researched in the field of epigenetics, and there have been a lot of studies, and continue to be more studies, about how your environment can impact your genes. So there is a relationship between genes and the environment. So it's not as simple as saying it's black or white.
Yeah, I think it's, what we have, the summary, the crib note version here, it's not nature versus nurture, it's nature and nurture.
Hmm.
I would highly recommend, in fact, I'm curious to know, Erica, if you have read it. It came out in 2015 in the journal Nature, and the title is Meta-analysis of the Heritability of Human Traits Based on 50 Years of Twin Studies. Did you
Hmm.
review that one?
It's probably in my, yeah, it's probably, I'm sure it's probably in my notes on the twin sections. I had a lot of studies, and if it was in the last recent years, I'm sure I came
It
across
is,
it.
it's probably one of the most, well, certainly the most at the time, and I can't imagine that it has been topped. It was absolutely, they looked at 14, that was a meta-analysis, so that their total at the end was 14 million twin pairs across
Yeah.
39 different countries. I also interviewed the author and not well the lead author. I mean, there was quite a few. It also was a great story in that each of the researchers did they worked on this independently. Each of them. I mean, they were all together, but they were not being funded. They each found time and they worked on it for years and years, and had no idea if it was ever. Of course, you never know if your research is going to be published. But they were fitting this in, and then, sure enough, it gets finally accepted into one of the most prestigious of the journals. So it was, a huge win for them. The title of
Wow.
that podcast is Genetics versus Environment, which shapes our kids the most. You can find that
Great.
again
I'll have to
on our
listen.
site. Yeah, what they did, and so I recommend for people who are interested in this at all, they looked at, and I don't remember now how many traits, but I mean, everything you could possibly imagine, and tried to analyze how much of it, and they gave it a percentage, how much is influenced by it, how heritable it is, how much is influenced by your genes, things that you would think of. Depression, anxiety, bipolar, ADHD, intelligence, weight, height, cancer risk, cardiovascular, personality traits, reproductive issues, longevity, propensity to addiction. I mean, the list of traits that they did was so fascinating. Anyway, so
Yeah, yeah.
from what you have read and talking about twin studies particularly, and then we're going to come and talk about adoption studies, but for twin studies, other than this kind of the general, just that nature and nurture are both highly influential, is there anything else that you would say that is a takeaway from having, I'm sure you have read many, many of the twin studies, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that genes matter. And I think some scientists say genes matter above all else. They still say that, there is prominent scientists out there who say that. But I would also say with the twin studies that, there have been critiques of the twin studies, and particularly also, even if you were thinking about how we think about it in the public, a lot of fascination with sameness, twins who are
Mhm.
raised apart, and maybe it's, uncanny that they seem to have, like the Jim twins, for example, married women with the same name or named their
That there's
dog the
just
same, that, yeah.
it's just weird. And then their second marriage, they both divorced, and then their the women, and this is they did not know each other, and their second
Right.
wives had the same first name.
Yes, yes,
It's just
exactly.
weird. It's just
Yeah.
weird.
And it is, and I think for all the reasons it's fascinating to us. But there are many twins, my twins, these twins in the book, who, while they have identical genes, do not have all of these, glaring personality traits that seem to be like mirror
Uh-huh.
images of each other. And inevitably with the twins in the book, for example, but even as I'm raising my own twins in the same house, their personalities
Hmm.
very different.
Hmm.
And so with the twins in the book, they, of course that they're going to have these different personalities, raised with different cultures, different languages, different ways of life completely. Although there are similarities, there are some mannerisms and, their features, for example, and some personality traits, but they're also very distinct. So it's clear that that is environment and it plays a role too. But we do fixate on the ones that
Yes.
are, like the Jim twins, and
And I think that is, I'm so glad you,
can skew our
yes,
perception. Yeah.
exactly.
Right.
It's like we will hear stories of, I mean, the narrative in adoption we will often hear is, oh, as soon as you adopt, you're going to get pregnant, assuming that you've come to adoption through infertility. And the
Mhm.
reason that fascinates people is that it stands out. It actually is not true. It's not more common. I mean, not more common than natural conception for somebody who has not been able to conceive. So it's basically the same, but that story has a good narrative. It's a good narrative, and people hear it and they remember it, and because it stands out, and so we're fascinated by it, and we repeat it, so it makes it seem. And the same with twins, I think that we're so fascinated by the potential similarities that those stories, the Jim twin stories, are the ones that we remember. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And they'll stick out through time. But it doesn't mean that that's the same for all twins. And even within science, you'll find that there are these relevant differences, but then there are these rare cases that people remember.
I want to share one of my favorite parenting resources with you. Thanks to our partner, the Jockey Being Family Foundation, we have 12 free online courses for you. They are generally aimed at parenting, and you can find out all 12 of them or access all 12 of them by going to bit.ly/JBF support. That's bit.ly/ this is all one word, JBF support. You could see the titles, you could click on them, you could get a certificate of completion if that is important, if you need to show continuing education. So pop on over to bit.ly/JBF support. Check them out. So and you spent a lot of time with both Isabella and Ha. What would be you said there were some similarities and there were some differences. What are some of the similarities, and then what are some of the differences that you would either attribute to the fact that their twins are not identical humans, and also to the fact that their environments were different for these two girls?
Yeah, I mean, there was an IQ study conducted by Nancy Segal, and there was a difference in their IQs, which was a considerable difference. But
between Isabella and Ha?
Yeah.
Interesting.
But again, very different educational upbringings. And also the IQ test has been critiqued through history for us having bias, and it has shifted over time. It has changed over time. And, so there are reasons to question even like these measures, right? Is the IQ an accurate measure of intelligence?
Or does it measure Western?
Exactly.
Would a person
Yeah.
who was raised in an upper middle class or wealthy
Right.
family in the Midwest U.S., would you expect that person to do better on an IQ test than you would? I don't know the answer to that, but that would be a question.
Yeah, that's the critique, because it has this Western influence, right? And so, has growing up, again, different language, different upbringings entirely, culturally. And so to expect her to have the same IQ is a stretch, although, they're both really smart. It just, but these kind of measures, scientists still look at them. But the other parts that, just as far as knowing the girls, the sisters, the similarities, I would say that growing up, they had, love for their families, but they also sometimes didn't like click with have lots of groups of friends, like not social butterflies.
Mm-hmm.
And is that gene? It's hard to say if that's genes or environment, but that's something that, it takes them a while, both of them, to kind of find their people and to trust
Mm-hmm.
their people.
Mm-hmm.
And they found that in each other. And then there's just certain mannerisms, just being around them. But I would say to me, they're very distinct and unique and individual.
Did Dr. Segal do any other specific test on this pair? IQ you mentioned.
Yeah, she did little tests. I mentioned them in the book, but again, they weren't anything that jumped out as like the Jim twins kind of thing. So that's why I think like they are very unique people who you're not going to find the twin story that we could maybe have come to know through some of these popular accounts in the research even on them, because they are so different. And it seems kind of inevitable based on how they were raised, totally different environments.
Hmm.
So, of course, that has shaped them in different ways.
Sure, how could it not? And yet they
Yeah.
both had, in some ways, a similarity in their environment would be that they both had something that made them an outsider. For
Yeah.
Ha, being raised by a lesbian couple, her moms were lesbian, were same sex couple, and for Isabella, being adopted would have that would be an impact. So, I mean, that would make her potentially stand out. So, that was an interesting thing to me when I was really thinking about the fact that that is something that they would both have had in common.
Yeah, I think that was something that they even bonded over later when they
Hmm.
finally reunited, because they didn't immediately click, but it was in sharing their experiences of, maybe feeling like outsiders, like you said, for whatever reason in different periods of their life, or experiencing bullying in different
Hmm.
periods of their life, that helped them draw them closer to each other.
Hmm. So let's talk a little about adoption studies, because you also went through, and there have been a lot of adoption studies, another area that we dive very deep into here for obvious reasons, since that's our demographic that we serve. But in general, what would you say that the adoption studies have shown?
Are you talking about the nature versus nurture type
Yeah.
of studies, or?
Well, one would have that's the traditional thing. Well, there are other things as far as that you didn't get into, openness and things like that, that are also a part of adoption studies. But the nature versus nurture part, I think, would be the relevant one here.
Yeah, I mean, for the adoption studies, I really just looked at how they've been used historically, which was similar, like the studying, as I mentioned earlier, of children who are separated, for example, from their birth families, and who have been studied to try to understand all the traits as well, and how that has played out, like their own lives and their adoptive families versus their
Hmm.
birth families. But a lot of the adoption research that I got into had more to do with identity, I think, and like the adapting and being raised in certain environments and things like that. So I looked at like the history of transracial and transnational adoption and things like that.
Hmm.
And so I could talk about that a little bit
Sure.
if you want. Yeah.
Certainly, yeah.
I mean, from what I understood from the research, there have been a lot of studies around how particularly transracial adoptees have adapted, and how they formed identity and have grown up. And, there's been studies by people like, I think Rita Simon is one of the popular voices
Hmm.
in this space. But the critiques from critical adoption scholars, talk about how a lot of the adoption studies have been led by maybe adoptive parents. And so the newer wave of adoption studies have often been led by adoptees,
Hmm.
many of them transracial adoptees, who have, brought in more complicated results, and been more direct about some of the experiences around racial identity formation and feelings of, whatever that might be, just not adapting into the environment or not feeling like they're fitting in. And so that I think that I delved into a lot of critical adoption research, which I had not been familiar with as much before.
Hmm. Yes, and both exist out there.
Yeah.
Guys, I have a request. If you are enjoying this podcast, either this particular one, which as you could tell, I'm very much enjoying, or any of our podcasts, we would love for you to tell a friend or your family about the creatingafamily.org podcast. People find out about podcasts through others. That's how I find out about podcasts. That's how everyone I know finds out about podcasts. So that's how you could help us, is if you would let others know that this podcast exists. Thank you. All right, let's continue the story. We've talked about the fact that the girls were born at several months old. They were separated. Then they were raised independently. How did they reunite? It's also a fascinating story of how. Anyway, but tell us the story of how they found out about each other. I think Ha always knew about her sister, but or at a very relatively young age.
They knew about each other, but the adoptive mother in the US found out about the fact that Isabella had a twin and she made it sort of her mission to reunite them, and spent several years traveling back and forth to Vietnam trying to locate her twin, and eventually does track her down in her village. And then they're not reunited again they're not reunited for till a couple of years later. So they were reunited when they were 13.
Mm-hmm. Again, probably not the best age in which to choose to throw something so huge, but nonetheless, that's how it worked out. But yeah.
That is how it worked out. And I did, again, I spoke to the adoptees who are, in the experts on this, I think, who have been through maybe reunion or tried to reunite, or who are psychologists themselves nowadays, and particularly transracial, transnational adoptees. And, that decision to search, many of them expressed to me, should be adoptee led. So making the decision on behalf, that did happen in the book, but I think that there's conversations to be had around that. And also the psychological services, I think, was another discussion, like, because reunion, what I've learned through this whole process, can also be traumatic. So while we have these ideas of sort of fairy tale narratives that I get at in the book, whether it's the fairy tale of adoption, the fairy tale of twins, or the fairy tale of reunion, when you pull back the layers on all of these, they're much more complex, and in some cases can be painful and dark. When you think about twin studies, when you think about, everybody else that's brought into the process of a reunion, even if it's originally with the twins, there's a lot of families that were brought in, and family members, and everybody has their own connection to this adoption. And so there's a lot of pain and trauma there. So I do talk a lot about that. And I talk also about the narratives of adoption that we've come to understand, and how the reality is also much more complex.
Because humans are more complex. So to think that it can be. How did the girls respond when they were reunited, when Isabella and her family came to Vietnam to meet Ha and her family? So how was the reunion for the girls?
I think it was awkward. And it was, if you read that moment, it's not the reunion you'll see on TV, right? The Good Morning America version of it. It's, you can see the discomfort and awkwardness, and even just kind of, particularly for Isabella in that moment, like not wanting to be doing this at this moment. She just didn't feel ready, and was sort of thrown
Pushed
into it.
But yes, yeah, it was certainly not an adoptee-led. And there was you could easily find it on YouTube. It was two girls, again, identical twins, and I'm going to guess they were probably 10 or so. And whose idea this was, I have no idea, but they were reunited on national television.
And I have a scene like that in the book, actually, with one of the pairs of twins that was reunited on.
Yes.
Not these ones, but yeah.
Yes, I think it was the ones that you were talking, I think it was the ones that were in the book. And it was on, number one, I mean, just wrong to do it. But it was the fairy tale. It was exactly what everybody wants to believe. Now, was that the girls' real response, or was that what they were coached to do? Or I don't know. It seemed genuine, but nonetheless, that's not something that should ever be.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be for public consumption. That was their moment.
There was a lot of critique on that. If you just read the comments on that video online, if this is the same one I'm thinking, but there's been a couple, but this one, they were quite young. And while people are crying because it's very overwhelming, emotional, right?
Sure. Sure.
And it was very much this made for TV moment.
Yes.
But at the same time, you felt like you shouldn't be witness to that. Like, it's not, it's a spectacle. And I think that, that reunions and twins and these adoption, like fairy tale stories, have been made out to be these spectacles sometimes for public consumption. And again, it's just like, everybody's human. They're going to have a different way of feeling about all this. In these cases, you're dealing with young children who, I mean, it's overwhelming, I think. And so, yeah, there is critique of that. There are adoptee experts who talk about that in the book and how to go about this process and how adoptees should be leading that, and it hasn't been done that way all the time, and it wasn't done that way in the book, and the adopted mom certainly thought she was doing what she believed was right. She believed these twins should be reunited, and to be honest, they're very close. They are very reunited now and living, and so it's complicated is all I have to say about, it is more complicated than the TV reunion. There were many people brought into that reunion that also had a lot of pain around it.
And that's what I want to talk about now. I want to talk about, first of all, because your point is so well taken, that in this case we had of course the two girls themselves, and that's and they should be paramount. We want to talk about that, but also we have their both of their adoptive families, how that impacted them. We have their birth family, how they were impacted. So I want to tease that out. First of all, you've kind of alluded to it, but the reunion for these girls was stressful. So they were about 13.
Yeah.
And then they got and you also have to acknowledge there's a language barrier.
And they didn't speak the same language for years.
Yeah, so
they couldn't communicate.
So what happens after? I want to talk about how the reunion played out for them. Then I want to focus on all the other players, all the other families, and how it impacted them as well. So the girls were 13, and then Isabella went home, and they were apart. But that didn't last forever. So what happened then?
Yeah, so a couple years later, well, actually, I'm sorry. So they were reunited when they were 13. And then at that point, the family in the US starts sending resources to the family in Vietnam, particularly supporting the education for Ha and helping her to get into a more elite school outside of the countryside where she lived, and learning English, for example. And so she ends up in a school that's challenging. It costs money. So the students who are there are sort of not used to the student coming in from like a small village in, in the countryside. And she also experiences some bullying there, and struggles at first. She really struggles to be at the level of the education that they have at the school. So she's working toward that. Meanwhile, Isabella is living her life in the US and having a lot of hard times, just also really getting bullied, homeschools, eventually switches schools because of this. So both of them have a hard time, fitting into their environment.
In their adolescence.
Yeah, in their adolescence. It's just like, so they're going through this, they've gone through a reunion, which is going to bring up all kinds of emotions, as you can imagine, at the same age when they're also going through these. I mean, I don't know if you remember being 13, but that was the roughest age for me.
Oh, yeah.
And then you add on all these other things that are happening, and it's a lot, it's
a lot.
Yeah. And so it doesn't make for the fairy tale. It makes for, again, a story that's very real. These are the kind of things that people have lived through, and people, but it doesn't always read as something that part is not uplifting. That's hard. It's painful to read.
Yeah, it is. But you did a good job of respecting their story and not trying to put the fairy tale on it, which I appreciated. I thought that I think there's a tendency to try to want to gloss over, and you didn't do that, and I appreciated that. Eventually, the Isabella's family pays for Ha to come to the United States. How old was she then?
So at that point, I believe she was 17, and I have to check that in the book, but she was,
I think,
coming. Yeah. And so she ends up coming to the US. That's another tough moment in the book because she leaves behind her family in Vietnam, and, they had never thought she would leave. So I think that becomes another element of, again, all the people affected by a reunion that maybe weren't initially all part of the twins, right? You think when in the mother's mind, in the adoptive mother's mind, but there were these people that were deeply affected
Yes.
through this reunion. At the same time, Ha's moving to be with her sister and to have this education that she comes to realize she really wants in the US. So
Hmm.
that is sort of a story that I think a lot of people who are immigrants, for example, or who are children of immigrants can relate to. Certainly my family, moving to the US in search of like a better life as they believe it to be, and then leaving behind culture and people they love is a
Hmm.
hard part. It's a hard reality. It's another fairy tale that we're sort of
Yeah.
taught, like you come to America and you're going to live
Hmm.
the dream. But like the part that's not often talked about is what you leave behind and what you lose.
Hmm.
So that's all part of the story that happens. But she does make it to the US and ends up living with her sister. And again, it's not an easy automatic connection, but they do eventually connect, and they're very close now, incredibly close. And so, you know, they went through all this, and I just think are like really linked together and close to each other and supportive for each other now. So it's interesting, and it is an
Hmm.
emotional journey, I think, to see it all happen. And I'm just capturing that snapshot of their lives. Like their lives have gone on. They're in their mid
Hmm.
20s now, you know. So this happened a long time ago, but I'm kind of capturing that arc
Yeah,
of when it all
that arc
happened.
of when it was happening. I want to thank Children's House International for being a partner and supporting this show. Children's House International is a Hague accredited international adoption agency, and they currently place kids from 14 countries, and they place with families throughout the United States. They also have an international surrogacy program for people who are considering surrogacy and want to look abroad. They have a consulting practice to help you make decisions along that journey as well. So that's Children's House International. All right, let's now talk about the family in Vietnam. There are two families in Vietnam. The one that in the book that my heart broke for in many ways was Ha's adoptive family. Because originally, when the U.S. family, the U.S. adoptive family, offered them money, they didn't want it. They were like, "We're fine. You know, we've." And they could. I mean, it wasn't like they had a lot of money. They didn't. Ha talks about going to bed hungry, so it wasn't just material things that they were missing, because that's another thing. That's another myth that we could say, oh, the noble, the noble native type of thing, where their life is superior. There were times where it wasn't superior. I mean, there was food issues. Yes, they didn't have electricity, and you could say, well, but on the other hand, they had, and she talks about that, appreciating nature and appreciating the sun and the moon and things like that, and stars, and that she might not have appreciated had she had electricity. But food is another issue. But her family, her moms, I think it read like they were very afraid that they were going to lose her to this wealthy Western family. Would that be a correct assessment of how you read it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they didn't trust the family. The family kind of came in to their village one day out of nowhere. And like, I think it was jarring for everybody. And they had always worried about her being taken, for example, kidnapped
Mhm.
or something like that.
I
So they
think
were
every
very
adoptive
protective.
parent has, I mean, it's an irrational fear, but I think it's something we deal with, trying to help parents, realize that this, in many cases, but regardless of whether you're a Vietnamese mom or an American adoptive mom, I think it is a common fear.
And I think in Vietnam, there had been a history, though, of babies being taken, for example, and sold on the black market. So I do get into that in the book, which was occurring around the time that Isabella and Olivia were adopted. So there is a valid history of fear there.
Mhm.
And so they were very, very protective, so it was every little step from Ha moving you know, to the city to get
Mhm.
this education.
She did not go she left her village, is what you're saying, yes, to go get the
Right.
education, right.
Yeah, initially, and then kept going farther until she finally goes to America. And I think they, were very sad by that,
Hmm.
and heartbroken by like losing their child. Although at the same time, children often do grow up and go off and do their lives. So that was sort of the decision she made. You could say maybe the decision would have been different if she hadn't been introduced to this whole new family. But, these were decisions she also took upon herself and empowered herself in ways to think like,
Hmm.
here's this other opportunity I could take. Here are these things I could do. But it's also sad to read the mothers who are letting go of their child who
Hmm.
has grown up and made these decisions for herself. Right. And
Hmm.
so everything I think in this book is more complex than it might be if you're just telling the really quick version of it. And
Hmm.
I think that just makes it all more real. And it's not always the version that is the the beautiful kind of fairy tale narrative of it all, but it's the more honest version. That was what
Sure.
I was going for.
Well, and I would also say though that there is beauty and it's complex. It's not all dark.
Yeah.
Isabella and Ha are very close. And interestingly, my reading of the book was that the adoptive U.S. mom is very close now with the adopted Vietnamese moms.
Yeah.
And I mean, they have a relationship separate from the girls. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah, it's,
It's more complicated with the birth mom. The birth mom
yeah.
has
Now I was going to
more.
say, let's talk about the
Yeah.
birth mom now. It is more complicated for
Yeah.
a variety of reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the birth mom, there's always been the feeling with the sisters of the feeling, well, particularly with Ha, who grew up in Vietnam and knew her birth mom, sort of this feeling of not being wanted. And so she was grappling with that. And I think that is a real emotion she expressed as like, well, gave me away, or she was bullied for being the child that her parents gave away. That was
Hmm.
something she dealt with. So there's this sort of, but the birth mom, again, she struggled and she loved them and made the decision on their behalf to do what she believed was best, right? And so I do begin the book with a sort of just tribute to like all mothers and grandmothers who I think, whether you're the mother in Vietnam or the adoptive mothers in Vietnam or the adoptive mother in the US, like everybody here is trying to do what they think is best for the children.
Hmm.
And they all maybe have a
In this
different.
case, yes, I think, yeah, maybe not always, but certainly in this
Right.
case, I would
Yeah.
agree. Although the birth mom had met a new man who did not want to raise the twins, and she had a child very shortly thereafter, which I think probably complicated the
Sure.
feelings for
Yeah,
the girls, or
it did.
at least for
For Ha,
Ha.
who knew much more about it, right?
Yeah.
Certainly. She talks about that openly in the book, you know. And then after a reunion and everything, there was always the challenge of money. And so that was something that adoptees expressed to me. Again, reunion is portrayed on TV through the shows as like happy ending, done. But you are then bringing in family members who, are you prepared to give money? Are you prepared? And how do you feel about that when you feel like maybe you've been neglected? Like all of those emotions are very real and valid, and adoptees talk about it openly in the book, and they experience that too. And so I think, yet again, it just is more complicated than the simple version.
Which brings me to something I wanted to talk about, and that is the disparate wealth of the families. And one of the first things that the birth mom did was send a letter to the adoptive family asking for money. And so, one of the complicating things, and certainly now, both Isabella and Ha are sending money to not only their birth mom, but also their half siblings of the two younger daughters. And those women in Vietnam now have children. So they're now supporting their nieces, half nieces, and nephews. And then one has to wonder, when does it stop? I mean, they have to wonder that. And for the adoptive family, also to wonder, and yet they are family, but at what point and how do you separate that? And interestingly, well, let me just pause there. Go ahead. So and this adoptive family is choosing to continue, or at least up to the point in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've certainly supported the family members of Vietnam a lot, and I witnessed that. I feel like I know that there is a part in the end of the book where the sisters talk about that, particularly Ha feels that responsibility.
Hmm.
She's always said to her adoptive moms that she would take care of them. Like that was part of this whole journey for her, was to take care of them. But then she said,
But that's a
even,
different thing. Now she's taking care of the parents who
yeah,
raised her, and she does talk about
right.
that.
But then
But
she
yeah,
does say in the end, with even with all of the complications with her birth mom, she also feels like there is that
mhm,
responsibility too
right.
with her. And so that's a lot for a young person who has not like found the job yet. And
Oh, absolutely. And you're right, it is more for her to feel that, and she feels it in a different way. But the US adoptive family also is supporting both families and grandchildren and the whole of the birth mom. And it's again something that we don't think about when we think about reunions. And it's fine to say that that's exactly how it should be. You're not taking a position one way or the other, and I'm certainly not taking a position. It's just
just complicated. It's very complicated. It's like
mhm.
the discussions that maybe people haven't had or don't think about when they're going through it. And it is worth listening to the stories of adoptees. And there are many
Mhm.
stories out there with podcasts now and everything, all the different ways
Mhm.
to really hear what these experiences have been like, because they're going to be different for everybody, right?
Sure.
And some people look for birth families and never find them. And that's another kind of trauma. Some people don't want to do that at all, and that's their choice, and that's totally fine, you know?
Right.
And so it's just, there's no one way, but it is really worth listening before making all the decisions. I think there's a lot of resources, and this book has one version of a story, and then there's a lot of resources in the book, I think, that people could also read and listen to podcasts and just
Uh-huh.
to think about how complex it really is, you know.
And I'll throw out another complication that parents sometimes feels, and this is an international adoption that I'm specifically speaking of. If they don't take steps early, and this is not for separated twins per se, that's a more extreme, but for finding a birth family or siblings or whatever, the trail often gets cold. So if they want something they have to wrestle with is if as a parent I think this would be important for my child, and I'm respectful that the child needs to make the decision, but that may be 18, 20, 25 years down the road. And the trail is hotter now than it's going to be. So should I try to find information to preserve it for my child, or is that me taking the lead and not allowing the adopted person to take the lead?
That is a good question. And
Hmm.
I'm not the expert on that answer for sure, but I'm sure it's something to grapple with,
It
right?
is something to grapple with. There isn't the right answer,
Yeah,
except
exactly.
for to the extent that if you think it's going to be important, I do think time matters. So, but it's hard
Yeah.
because I think, especially if you listen to Isabella's story here, and Ha as well, but perhaps more Isabella, but it did feel like this was being shoved upon her in ways that made me uncomfortable, certainly as a parent, where I would have wanted to protect her more. Yeah. So either way,
Yeah.
well, it's a great read. Somewhere Sisters, a story of adoption, identity, and the meaning of family. It was it read so smoothly and so interestingly, and I truly couldn't put it down. So
Thank you.
I thank you for having read it, of having written it.
Thank you. Well, thank you for reading it. And like I said, it is, people might pick it up and think, well, it's a story that maybe you've heard before because you've heard of twins being reunited. And I think it's much more than that. So
I agree. It also it shows the different without taking a side necessarily. It shows we keep coming back to the word complicated or complex, but and it shows the gray. I am a human that lives in gray,
yes.
and I'm actually more comfortable in gray. That's the only way I see the world. So I think that perhaps is why this book spoke to me, is that it shows the gray
Yeah.
without shoving a position one way or the other, because you're very clear that there are many good things that happened out of this as well. Many.
Yeah, and I wanted everybody to just hear the stories as they're told to me and know the research as I learned the research.
Hmm.
And then you can walk away and think about it all,
And you
and
will.
yeah, and form your own ideas of what you think.
Yeah,
Certainly that was my intention, and it
yeah.
wasn't to like shove down one kind of perspective down
Narrative.
your throat.
No, and you traveled with them to Vietnam, so you have talked with all the families involved. One last question. I'm so it ended where Ha was in, or the both girls were in college. Did Ha, her visa at some point was going to expire, and I know her moms were pushing her to not forget that she was going to come home. Did she eventually? Now she's in her mid-20s. Did she eventually return home or return to Vietnam?
She's in Vietnam right now trying to renew her visa. So that's
Yeah,
what she's working on. But I think, has all the plans to come back to the US and keep studying, working, whatever she can do here for
they're
now.
pursuing her. And,
Yeah.
and I will say that what we did not touch on here, but I want people to know that it's covered a lot in the book, is Olivia's experience, who was in many ways raised she was, I guess, almost exactly 1 year younger than Isabella. And in many ways raised as Isabella's twin. Not really,
Right.
but well, yeah, really, because their mother dressed them alike. So anyway, and so we don't have time to go into it, but that's also how this impacted her, and actually her own journey as she was a character in the book that I really liked. So anyway,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. She's an incredibly young woman, and her story is really memorable too. And
it
I
is.
believed it was important to the book as well.
I agree, yes. Well, thank you, Erica Hayasaki, for talking with us today about identical twins separated at birth, but specifically the book Somewhere Sisters, A Story of Adoption, Identity, and the Meaning of Family. I truly appreciated and enjoyed this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.